I'm Nana Rose. This is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. This is Chapter 8, The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to them to watch. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out now, 5! Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said 5 in a sulky tone. 7 jogged my elbow. On which 7 looked up and said, "That's right. Always lay the blame on others." "You better not talk," said 5. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserved to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, 2, said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brush and had just begun, "Well, of all the unjust things," when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked around also, and all of them bowed low. I thought rather than showing you the illustrations in the book, which are small, I would show you the illustrations this way, in a larger version. "Would you tell me, please," said Alice a little timidly, "why are you painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2, who began in a low voice. "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put in a white one by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to—" At this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their heads and hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 and 2 as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And last of all the grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face, like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions, and besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people had to lie down on their faces? They couldn't see it. So she stood where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turned to Alice. She went on, "What is your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree. For you see, as they were lying on their faces, and the patterns were on their backs, was the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were gardeners or soldiers or courtiers or 3 of her children. And here is the Queen meeting Alice, or Alice meeting the Queen. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. "It's no business of mine." The queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, began screaming, "Off with her head! Off with—" "Nonsense," said Alice very loudly and decidedly. And the queen was silent. The king laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she's only a child." The queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so very carefully with one foot. "Get up," said the queen in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the queen and the king, the royal children, and everybody else. "Leave off that," screamed the queen. "You make me giddy." And then turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your majesty," said the 2 in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke. "We were trying—" "I see," said the queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads." And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "Oh, you shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2 looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the queen. "Their heads are gone, if it please your majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then," roared the queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under the sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'What a pity'?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I asked, 'What for?'" She boxed the queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Hush," the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The queen will hear you. You see, she shall come rather late." And the queen said, "Get to your places," shouted the queen in a voice of thunder. And people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or 2, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on hands and feet to make the arches. And here's Alice with her flamingo, with her foot on a hedgehog croquet ball.